As we just saw, the user tables give the user 100% flexibility in order to change the forms generated by the pattern. On the other hand, from the codification point of view, the WorkWithPlus allows the user to enter custom code on the events, rules, or conditions of each web panel without this code being overwritten when we reapply the pattern. Furthermore, we can add more events and variables on the forms. Let's see an example. Let's go to the panel Work with Person, and for example, in the Start event, we can add code outside the limits of the code generated by the pattern. In this case, if today's month, for example, equals 12, then we will set the visible property of our user table to 0. Now let's add more code. For example, if person first name equals John, then person first name should be bold. Then we save the object and we go back to the instance of the pattern. Here again, we can change the order in which the attributes will be shown in the transaction. Let's go to the instance of the pattern then, and change the order of some attributes so that then we can reapply the pattern. Then we reopen the object and we will see that we didn't lose the code we just entered, and we also didn't lose the user table created on the form. So here's the code. So the user tables and the code will remain after reapplying the pattern. Now, all the functionalities that were just showed form part of the reason for which we wanted to create the WorkWithPlus pattern, so that the users wouldn't lose the link with the pattern and take advantage of all the potential that the WorkWith had now in the WorkWithPlus. After these problems were solved, the WorkWithPlus pattern continued to evolve and more functionalities were added. Let's take a look. The first functionality is the column selector. The column selector is a functionality that will allow the user to decide in runtime which columns of the grid to show and in which order. It has to be selected for each grid that we want to have the column selector applied to. We select the grid and set the column selector property in true. Then we can specify which attributes inside the grid will be visible by default with the property visible by default of each attribute. Then we reapply and execute to see the results. This was done over the grid of the Work With person. Here we can see the conventional Work With object with the difference that now it has a button to select the columns and the order of them. Here we can select which columns are visible and which are invisible, and we can move from one place to another. In this case, we would like to select person full name, person nickname, person hobby, person home address, and person last name, and we want person last name to be the first column of the grid. After making these changes, we select Update Columns and see the results. So, this is the column selector property. The property is required allows us to identify which attributes will be set as required in the transaction of an object. If we want it to be required in the transaction person first name, person last name, and person nickname, we select them and check the property is required. Now we can see in the preview that the attributes are differentiated from the rest of the attributes. Furthermore, a rule is created for each required attribute in order to demand a value for each of them. This is the property is required. Now, it is true that the user has complete flexibility in the creation of the forms in the instance of the pattern, but it is difficult to imagine how they will end up being created just by looking at the tree in the instance. With the preview functionality, we can see an example of how the form will be created without the need to apply the pattern and run the application. This functionality was already shown during the tutorial, and it applies to each form that is created by the pattern. For example, we can see an example of the selection form that will be created after applying the pattern. Let's take a look at another functionality. WorkWithPlus allows the user to add auditing code in every action of every transaction. This means that after every action of a selected transaction, a procedure will be called in which the user has complete control. The user can select to add code in this procedure, for example, that for every time a new record is added to this transaction, a log is populated or notifications are sent. Now, the last functionality is the possibility to create with the WorkWithPlus the form of the transaction, which can be manipulated by any user. Here, we can see the form of the transaction with its tables by default, and we can see a preview of how it will be created. If we wanted that the table that contains the attributes had 4 columns, for example, we can see a preview again to see effects of this change in the generation. Let's change the number of columns and see again the preview of the form of the transaction. After this, we gave an idea of some of the functionalities of the new WorkWithPlus pattern, and to conclude, we would like to say that on one hand, WorkWithPlus solves some of the problems in the WorkWith pattern, giving a great deal of flexibility to the user of the pattern in how the objects are generated and allowing particular developments on the forms without losing the link with pattern. On the other hand, the WorkWithPlus pattern is constantly evolving with new functionalities requested by our clients. For more information on how to purchase the new WorkWithPlus pattern, please enter www.DVelopsoftware.com.